I have the pleasure and the privilege to welcome and introduce Selma Šabanovic, Associate Professor of Informatics and Cognitive Science at Indiana University, USA, founding director of the Human-Robot Interaction Lab at Indiana University. With a disciplinary background in science and technology studies, Professor Šabanovic is one of the very pioneers of humanities research in and on social robotics. Already from 2006 onwards, she has undertaken mixed methods approaches in the wild observation and cross-cultural comparative studies on human social behavior with robots, not only as individuals, but also in groups and with rather astounding results. So we are particularly happy that she agreed to open our conference, since her research illustrates par excellence how the critical perspectives of the humanities can be constructively used to develop culturally sustainable social robotics applications. This is something that she understands as, quote, a mutual shaping of technology and society. So thank you very much, Selma, for being with us. We are very much looking forward to your lecture and hope it will be able to be technologically realized. Welcome.
Fingers crossed. Thank you very much for the wonderful words in your introduction, and thank you, Johanna and Marco, for the invitation. I have been wanting to come to Robophilosophy for years, and this year I was like, yes, I'm going, I get to chat with everyone, and then coronavirus. But I'm sure we all share the same kind of joy in being able to be together remotely, and then slight disappointment in not being able to see each other in person, but there's always next time. But in the meantime, I'm really happy to also have had the opportunity to take this kind of talk as a moment to reflect on some of the work that I've done over the years. I just want to, in the talk, I want to kind of think through this notion of robots as a potential companion species for humanity. And so Johanna has already given a little bit of a intro to me, and I had meant to do that a little bit too, particularly to kind of show you some of my own history with robotics, and you'll see that it weaves throughout the talk. So on the upper, I don't even know which side corner, left, right, it depends where you're looking from, but you see me holding a baby seal robot. That's Paro. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it. And that's the first time I actually met Paro, in 2003. And that was when I was a graduate student. I had become intrigued by this seemingly contradictory notion of robots that are social. And I wanted to explore what that actually meant. How did people design sociality into robots? How did they think about sociality? How did that become embodied in this new technology? And through time, as I kind of studied that question, I realized that many of the questions that social scientists and humanists have are actually shared by the engineers and computer scientists and designers that create robots. And that's what inspired me to start my own human-robot interaction lab and get more directly involved in the work of social robotics and human-robot interaction. In the picture here that you see that looks kind of like a living room is actually from our lab. Our lab is in a house, which I think is kind of appropriate for the type of work that we do, since we're very interested, not necessarily in robotic technology that's going to happen in 30, 40, 50 years, but really thinking through how do we take the robotics technologies that we have today and see how people incorporate them in their everyday lives, how people respond to them, but also how you might want to kind of design them a little differently or figure out how to apply them a little differently to make it answer to people's diverse values, but diverse needs. So I think it's kind of appropriate that we're in a house. And I think it also kind of speaks to some of the themes that I want to talk about today, which are about this kind of domestication of robots, about kind of living with robots interspersed around us as the current dream and aim of much of robotic science is. So as I mentioned, I started with this being intrigued by this move from industrial robots, which I had actually known as a child because my father happens to be a robotics professor who studied industrial robots. So I was in these labs with these huge machines, you know, very scary, not very appealing at all, at least not to me. And so when robots started being touted as something that could be affectively connected to people, as something that we could actually interact with, I think Kismet being one of the first examples, something that could smile at us and then we could smile back. Ever since then, I've been trying to understand what does that actually mean in terms of robotics, but also what does it mean in terms of ourselves, the way that we kind of interpret ourselves, interpret our own kind of humanity and sociality. And in a more recent shift that's been equally intriguing, I would say, is the kind of melding of this industrial factory military style robotics with the social robotics to produce robots that we can use in everyday contexts. So here you just have two examples. One is Baxter, which is kind of a re-envisioning of industrial robots as a collaborator, something that's not separated from people, but actually working next to, with people, able to provide social cues like you see the eyes, things like gaze. And the other is a prototype autonomous vehicle, which is using eyes to communicate with people on the street to tell them what it means to do since there's no driver. So I think in the last, I don't know, 5 to 10 years, there's been this melding of the kind of industrial instrumental and the more social type of robotics. And people have different responses to this. So we can think of one response as wonderment. What is this thing in my shopping mall? Sometimes it's joy and wonder. But what we often see when we do these in the wild studies, or when we track how people use these kinds of robots in their everyday environments over a period of time, we see that they really start even after that initial moment of wonder or intrigue or being taken aback maybe, they start to really respond to the robots in ways that are similar to how we respond to other people. So here in the picture you see, this is a picture of Moxie, which is it's a robot that's being used in hospitals, developed by a startup from Texas. And here you see a staff member in the hospital kind of waving hi to Moxie as they pass each other in the hallway. So these kinds of reactions, social reactions that people give to robots, however instrumental, and even kind of a desire for more social interaction that people express when they're given social robots to work with, such as Baxter, is a kind of commonly seen occurrence in everyday uses of robotic technologies. And so, of course, there's always the question of what's the explanation for this? So one is, you know, people are naive, they anthropomorphize things, you know, this is just kind of a mistaken belief. But one thing that thinking through robots as companion species, one thing that I want to point out is I think that this way of looking at it kind of negates a long history of anthropomorphization of robots and other machines and just other things in the environment that are part of the human response and human sense making of the world around them. Kind of humans as themselves very social, as we call ourselves, social animals. And I want to show you just a little quick video. So this is, I think we don't have sound though, but this is Grace. This is from 2003. It's a robot that attempted to go to a, sorry, I'm moving it, trying to, okay, now you don't see me. I'll move it again. So I'm not sure if you saw that video, so I'm going to explain it. But in 2003, the robot Grace was designed by Carnegie Mellon to do what we didn't manage to do today, to physically go to a conference, register itself, and give a talk. And here the video shows, this is AAAI, it's a conference of artificial intelligence engineers. And the video shows Grace trying to get in line for the registration, but the robot mistakes this space between two people as the end of the line and kind of just walks in there. And then there's this big clapping and laughing and just cheering from the crowd of artificial intelligence researchers. And this is often brought up as the kind of most human moment of Grace, this moment where she went against, and I'm going to call her she, went against the social norms and cut the line, right? And so I often show this just to show that it's not just what you might call naive users who make these anthropomorphisms. Researchers do it all the time. And it's actually, I think, part of the construction of social robots, this continuing anthropomorphization. So in some sense, instead of battling it, it's something that I think we have to incorporate in our thinking about how we go about design and how we think about its consequences. And another thing in terms of this kind of work, I think it's important to remember how much work humans do in order to create these moments with robots. So we often think of robots as autonomous. We talk about them as autonomous, but there's so much work that goes on behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, both by designers in the back, but also users in the front, to make robots do the things that we want them to do and have the kind of effects that we want them to have. And so this is something that I think we need to think about. Don't worry about reading the slide I'm going to explain it anyway if you can't see the letters. So on the one hand, we see designers doing things like giving robots different kinds of capabilities to learn, to sense humans, to pick up on psychological and social cues, adapt, be legible to humans, which I think another speaker is going to talk about later in the conference. But it's not just about the robots, it's also about people, and thinking through how people are going to learn to work with robots, how we are going to adapt our environments to them, how we're going to adapt our behaviors to be, in some sense, ourselves legible to these robots. And I think one of the other things that kind of comes to my mind when I think of robots as companions, or companion species in some sense, is that it takes us away from just looking at the human-robot pair, which a lot of social robotics, human-robot interaction has looked at, and starts us thinking on questions of, what are the histories of humans and the histories of robots that are coming together in this interaction moment? What are we developing and building during the interaction? And kind of how do we co-evolve with these machines? So those are some of the questions that I want to think about. And also, I think often when we see these socialized robots, even if they're Baxter or a car with eyes, we often see the histories or the background in military work or the background in factory automation kind of covered up. Paro has it covered up with fur. Lots of robots have it covered up with kind of a plastic shiny exterior, but we don't often see what's on the inside and we can forget about it. But I think one of the questions that we also need to ask, which I think somebody is also talking about towards the end of the conference, is when we think about these technologies that have a very kind of factory-oriented or military-oriented logic and history, how do we translate them into our intimate spaces? How do we translate them into our homes or into our hospitals, into interactions with vulnerable populations like children, older adults, people who might be lonely or socially isolated, as folks are thinking about now with the COVID pandemic. So in my mind, this notion of the companion species might be able to help us think through some of these questions in a different way than we have before. And so one of the things we have to kind of think about a little bit now maybe is, what would robots be as a companion species? So for Haraway, companion species, she talks about a lot really in relation to dogs, a companion species that she's very familiar with. And actually, I think we are also familiar with, interestingly, in the lab. So the dog up top here is a dog that one of my students recently just got. And interestingly, the student works on a project where we're trying to help develop an adaptive dog robot for work with adults who have depression. So I think sometimes in people's stories, we can see these even almost literal interconnections between the companion species of the dog and the companion species of the robot. The thing that I think is interesting about the companion species idea is that it really focuses our attention on not just the categories, this is a social robot, an industrial robot, an actual dog, a robot dog, but really on the process of how do we kind of construct ourselves, or how do we how do we develop a relationship with something that's different from ourselves? And so another point that I think is important there is that it talks about the notion of respect. So we can have different kinds of relationships with others, and they can even be positive relationships. But one of the things that Haraway points out is, if you treat a dog like a baby or a child, that's not necessarily respecting its own kind of biological being, or the things that it needs or wants, or the way that it is, and those kinds of things. So I think we have similar problems with robots. So if we think of robots as automatically as a pet, just because they look like a dog, or if we treat them as some kind of maybe human-like other, is that actually kind of respecting both ourselves and the kind of mechanical form that we have in front of us? Or do we need to think differently about how they are other from us in order to have a kind of productive, positive interaction over the long term? And also, as I mentioned, I think another important thing is this notion of thinking through what are the kind of histories of design, of use, of where these machines come from, how we've developed with these machines before, that we can kind of keep in mind as we go into the future with new social robots. So I kind of like this, this quote by Haraway, which she actually uses for dogs, but I think we can use them for robots too, which is that they're creatures of possibility and also creatures of fierce and ordinary reality. And I think we hit on this in robotics all the time, in terms of we have these wonderful imaginations of robots, while at the same time if you're designing robots, you can see many of the very real constraints and places where our imaginations are quite hard to realize. So, you know, today we had problems even kind of getting the camera to work in this supposedly already outfitted room. Imagine trying to get a robot to navigate this or move itself around or anything like that. So I think this notion of possibility, and also the notion of still being anchored in reality, is very important in terms of robotics as well. So these are some of the reasons why I find this notion of companion species productive in terms of thinking with robots. And I also want to give a comment here, which is that I think when we hear the word companion species, we think of, you know, is this another version of kind of animalizing or anthropomorphizing robots? And from, as I was reading Haraway, I was happy to see that, for example, there she has a example that she gives of her father in his wheelchair, and talks about the wheelchair as a companion species. So the notion is it doesn't have to necessarily be an organic life form to kind of be thought of in this way. So having given that background, I just want to tell you quickly what I'm going to tell you about today, and it's really a kind of rethinking, trying to pull some of my previous work into this to think about how does this notion of companion species and the notion of robotics work together. So the first thing I'm going to talk about is Paro, and kind of unpacking the robot a little bit as a companion species. Then I'm going to talk about robotics and culture in Japan and how those things are co-constructed. And finally, I'm going to end with some discussion of how our practices, current practices of domesticating robots through everyday design and use, and what kinds of things we see from that as maybe possibilities for moving forward. So this is a picture of Paro in the lab in Tsukuba, where I was a participant observer in 2005. And so here you see just a bunch of Paros, and they are very much just a kind of, they were a tool. So for us as lab mates, Paro was something you could pick up one of these, put it in a bag, and take it to a nursing home or somewhere where you were going to study how people respond to it. And it was really a tool for producing science, for creating papers, results, kind of going about the everyday scientific practice. But it's interesting, I think, to look at the background of the Paro project, as well as the way that people then later respond to Paro. So for those of you that maybe don't know, Paro is actually an extremely long-running project. It started in the 90s as the development of an emotional creature. So Dr. Shibata was interested in this question of how you could use maybe physical presence and behavioral responses of a device to evoke effective responses from humans. And I know you can't see the picture very well, but at the top are some of the initial designs that were created before Paro even became Paro. And they're actually designs of dogs. So the dog connection comes out early on. And one of the very first designs or things they tested out was kind of a dog cutout with a tail that could wag, and a person could pet this piece of kind of cloth in front of them, and then the dog might move its tail in response to that. And they were studying what's the kind of response people have if the dog is responding to the touch that they're giving or not responding. And so over time, that actually very simplistic kind of translation of touch into response, into some kind of affect on the part of the human, has become a much more, I would say, complex understanding of what happens with when people interact with these kinds of responsive robots in an affective manner. So Paro later became a cat, and it finally became a seal. And I think here, the reason for making it into a seal is also kind of interesting in terms of the companion species notion, because the cat or dog shape actually were found to be too familiar. So people would be turned off by the fakeness of them compared to the dogs and cats that they knew. But the seal form was something that was familiar, but also unknown. It was more of an other that people didn't really know what to expect from. So it allowed both the people who were interacting with the robot and the researchers to kind of build up towards more long-term, towards more of an affective response and more long-term attachment through the notion of surprise and through the ability of people to kind of interpret the robot in ways that made sense for their context and their environment. And I think over time, Paro has come to embody a very relational understanding of design. So Dr. Shibata talks about how the robot itself has a limited number of functions, but through interactions, it can evoke associations in a user's mind and have many more functions than are actually embodied in the robot. So I think this very well exemplifies this notion of becoming together. So the robot and the human are kind of developing through the interaction itself. Another thing that we see is that people really try to make a place for robots in their everyday environments. So the first time that I went to the nursing home in Japan to see where they used Paro, they showed me this picture. And and it's of something called Paro's Home, and it's a little space in the nursing home that they made for the 3 Paros they had, and it was where they slept and ate or got recharged, and it was called Paro's Home, as you see up top, written in Japanese. So there was this desire to create this pet-like space for the robots. And I've also, over the years, kind of lent out Paro to friends because their children wanted to play with it. So when we're not using it in the lab, sometimes they would be like, can we just borrow Paro for 2 weeks? And I would say, sure. And these are some pictures from what happened when they took Paro home. So it always involved some kind of dress up, often reading to Paro, but that's how we ended up with Easter Paro, Christmas Paro, birthday Paro, etc. So there's this process of kind of making a place for the robot and kind of fitting it into existing practices to make it more maybe familiar and homely. Another thing that I found really rich is that we often, when we think of social robots, we consider the notion of people kind of connecting to the robot, but I think what is interesting to look at is also how people relate with, not just with the robot, but through the robot. So something we've been researching more recently is how do these robots like Paro actually inspire interaction between people? We've seen this happen in a nursing home with a daycare, and we've seen it happen in other places. This is just a picture from an intergenerational daycare with older adults and children. So the point I want to make here is that one thing that we can do if we think of robots as companion species is consider what kind of new acts of communication we're creating and how we're starting to kind of maybe even affectively connect with these new kinds of technologies. But it's not just these individual affective responses that I think are of interest. So Paro has been reinscribed kind of organizationally as well within society. So this is a picture of Paro's family registry in Japan, which is something that's given at every, it's a kind of official document that's given at births, marriages, deaths to kind of track persons in society. And so Paro has actually been given one as well from the city of Nanto, where it comes from. And I think it's particularly interesting to see that Paro came out of the city of Nanto because Nanto is one of the places in Japan that has the oldest population, the greatest percentage of older adults in the population. And Paro was kind of designed to, is most often used with older adults. So there's a kind of historical connection there that's also, I think, evocative. Paro's connection to that particular place comes out in other ways as well. So when I I had an opportunity to go to Nanto with Dr. Shibata, who designed Paro, and he showed us kind of different places in the area, and we were able, and explained Paro as kind of being connected to local craft. So we often think of robotic technologies as something that's very future oriented, but this was a description of the robot as something that's connected to the history of that particular locality, especially these traditional wood crafts that take a very long time to make and are very high quality and are therefore quite expensive. Dr. Shibata thinks of Paro in a similar way. It's actually still handmade. So the parts come from different places, but they're put together by hand. And so he sees some of this kind of craft work and focus on quality being instilled in the robot as well. So I think Paro, perhaps because I know Paro so well, but I think it speaks to a lot of these different dimensions of the companion species notion, to the kind of histories of development, to the way that the people and the robot have kind of grown together over time. And I think I'll be able to give you a few more examples of that when we look at how people use robots in their everyday spaces in just a little bit. But before we get to that, I wanted to kind of talk, as I was expanding a little more broadly from this individual connection with robots more to a societal and cultural connection, I wanted to talk a little bit about how we even can think of the coevolution of culture along with robots. And for this kind of work, I've particularly been interested in looking at Japan. One, because it's for a long time been talked about as the robot kingdom, but also because it's visible in my experience there, these interconnections of a culture that's in the making as robots are in the making has been quite apparent. So when I was in 2005 in Japan, they actually had a World Expo there, and it was really centered around the notion of robots. So in the around the notion of robots and around the notion of ecological health and how technology and ecological health can work together. And so here are just some examples. All over the space of the expo, you had robots. You had robot receptionists, robots taking care of kids, robot security, robot cleaners, et cetera, et cetera. So it was an interesting space to see this interconnection between kind of the notion of a Japan of the future and a world of the future and robotics. And of course, we know that there's a long history of the connection between technology, nation, and robots in Japan. So following World War II, of course, there was a need to kind of think through the consequences of technology. It was obviously something that could bring great destruction as well as great future possibilities. And one of the ways that this was kind of popularly rethought was through a particular robot, Astro Boy, shown up top here, which is these days kind of taken as something of a template for roboticists for the relationship between robots and people in the future. So this was a friendly robot that protected people, lived with a family. And in the lab that I was at in 2005, one of the humanoid robotics labs, the HRP lab, they actually had this poster of HRPX. So this future project they were aiming for, at that point they were working on HRP2, where that would actually be Astro Boy. There's also a lot of kind of reinvention. So how is Japanese culture being reinvented in connection to robots? Recently, connections are being made with old other kinds of old crafts, just like Paro was attached to old crafts. Robots here, Asimo is being compared to karakuri ningyo, which are these automata that were developed in Japan. And robots are also being kind of reinscribed through Japanese cultural practices. So there are practices of praying with the robot, getting married with the robot. Also, in terms of Sony Zaibo, actually kind of putting the robots to rest through Buddhist ceremonies when they no longer are operational. So there are different ways in which kind of cultural practice and robotics come together. And these are also visible directly in the work of robotics researchers. So this is just an example. This is the HRP, so that I just mentioned, the one where HRPX is Asimo. This was HRP2 at the time. And normally HRP was designed to be a kind of a construction worker or a robot that could use human tools, tractors, whatever, tools built for robots in dull, dirty, dangerous tasks. But here it actually found a purpose in carrying on Japanese cultural tradition. So it was taught to dance a Japanese folk dance, which the researchers were saying young adults didn't want to learn anymore. Nobody wanted to learn how to do this dance. So in order to kind of keep it alive and keep it available for posterity, they motion captured an actual human dancer and had the robot recreate it in its physical form. And I think what's interesting is that it actually hurt the robot to do this. It was not kind on its joints and things like that, but nevertheless, this was a kind of application that was deemed helpful and useful. Robots are also often inscribed as kind of cultural subjects. So Waseda University, which is one of the first universities in the world and definitely in Japan that made humanoid robots and still does, there are several faculty there who design robots that they say have kokoro, which is kind of a heart or emotion, intelligent intention all together. And one of the things that they explain is that this is a very different function from what you might think of as artificial intelligence or even some kind of affective modeling in Western robots. It's something that they even have a hard time explaining to others because it really depends on the nuances of language and of culture. At the same time, it's not just robots, it's users that are being kind of inscribed as particular cultural subjects in relation to the robots. So in Japan, we often hear this from outside, but we also hear it from Japanese roboticists. There's an expectation that Japanese users will be particularly positively oriented towards robots because of their cultural background. So because of Buddhist or Shinto, more animistic practices and beliefs, because of this popular culture surrounding robotics as a positive technology, the expectation is that they will be much more accepting of these kinds of products in the future. And there's also a discussion of what the cultural value of robots is for society. So how do we kind of remake society around the availability of robots? And that actually kind of revolves around the notion that people are aging, the number of workers is decreasing, so there's a need to have someone take that burden. And this is actually a kind of quote, I've heard this from researchers, but also from government documents, that instead of bringing in immigrants, robots are a kind of solution. And one of the reasons robots are a solution is because they can be kind of trained and designed to be more similar, kind of culturally similar to the existing kind of Japanese culture and Japanese population. So the development of these robots is also kind of a part of the development of a particular kind of vision of society in the future. So with this, I just want to point to this broader notion that I think is also part of the idea of companion species, which is that our cultures, ourselves, our institutions are also kind of mutually constituted with our design of these specific technologies. So people are, even when they're designing technologies in different ways, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, these kinds of questions become part of that design and part of that discussion. And finally, I want to come to this notion of domesticating robots. So actually creating spaces where we can cohabit or be together over time with robotic technologies. And the picture I have here is from a Bill Gates talk, or Bill Gates' piece in 2007, where he kind of posited that there would be a robot in every home. And I'm going to try to zoom in so you can actually see. I'll bring you, but I know you wanted to see me, but I'm like a little ant anyway here. Sorry, going the wrong way. And if you can see this picture, the picture is of a very middle class, upper middle class house in the US. And really, the only thing that's in here is a bunch of robots. There's a laundry folding robot, a lawnmower robot, a Roomba, and a robot taking care of an older adult, kind of right up there in the corner. And the only person in there is an older adult. There really aren't many other people. And I think this notion of the domestication of robots is very different from what we see when we actually put robots in people's everyday environments. So I'm going to just give you some examples of robots in people's everyday environments that kind of point out maybe a slightly different picture. So one of the first times that I got to work on this notion of robots in designing robots for people's use in their homes was with one of my students, who is now a professor here in Lee, where we looked at how people think about domestic robots in Korea and South Korea and the US. And we just had, Hiren had people kind of create their robots as a drawing or a collage and talk about what they thought were important qualities, what the robots would be doing in the home. And we were interested, it was interesting to see the differences between the South Korean and the US designs. So in the South Korean designs, we saw this kind of focus on something, both humanoid forms, but also the focus on something tender, relational, mother-like. Whereas in the US, the focus was more on style, functionality. In South Korea, people also focused on kind of having a relational robot, so something that brings people together, that the family can maybe use together for entertainment, for connection. Whereas in the US, it was also often an assistant, something for the individual. And of course, when we asked about security robots, the notion of security robots was vastly different. So in the US, we had this upper thing here is actually a kind of combination of a ground robot with some kind of gun or rifle thing that was supposed to protect the home. Whereas the Korean robot is a kind of humanoid creation that is supposed to be taking care of kids or protecting kids from getting hurt. So the reason I wanted to show these is I went kind of through the notion of how culture and robots are interconnected in the mind of designers. They're also similarly interconnected in the minds of users as well, who interpret robots and their needs related to robots in relation to their cultural ideas of what home means and other similar things. Oh, I guess there was a question, sorry. It's hard to always look at chat. Oh, okay, you can focus this. Sorry, I
Selma, we will do the Q&A after your talk.
No problem. I saw Selma and sometime I didn't know if you misspelled it, but this is actual Selma asking a question, so no problem. Great. So it was related. So I just wanted to point out how the cultural meaning of home technology, what it meant for the people who were supposed to be using it. And I think one of the things that the folks that we talked to had the most trouble with was they wanted to have robots for help, but they were also very worried about putting robots into certain kinds of tasks that they felt needed to be done by humans. So things like education or you see these caregiving robots, but it was actually very much a kind of conflicting desire for them and yet an ambivalence towards them at the same time, which of course we all understand. And sometimes we might say this is just related to, you know, these are traditionally tasks done by people, but that actually wasn't true. It's not about the traditionality of the task. It was actually about this human connection that they were afraid of losing. So one of the other things we noticed in the South Korean homes is that everybody had a dishwasher, but very few people used it. And the explanation for why was that kind of a mother would show her love to her family by washing the dishes by hand. It was an act of, there was a kind of affective meaning to the act that if you made it autonomous, would not be fulfilled. So kind of something to keep in mind as we construct these domestic robots. In the US, we've also looked at robots for the home. We particularly have looked at robots with older adults. And one of the things that struck us in early times is that many times when we would show robots that have been developed for older adults to them, they would say, this looks nice, but it's not for me. Which we hear a lot, but when we plumbed more into the depths of that, it turned out that the thing that people really disliked was the fact that all of the robots were designed with the notion of aging as a disability. So something that needs to be fixed, some lack that needs to be somehow rectified. But what the older adults actually later said that they wanted is something more that would more take on some of the positive aspects of aging. So the fact that they have more time to connect, they're not always at work, they have more time to connect with family, with peers, how to make that easier. But they also pointed out that there were many things that robots couldn't do, of course. They couldn't help address their financial concerns, their concerns about health insurance, some of the really big things bothering them. So I think we also need to keep that in mind. And we've done lots of projects with older adults in their homes, kind of doing participatory design. And I think one of the things that it shows, I know it's hard to see, is you actually start meeting people in their homes and seeing what it looks like. So when we started going to people's homes, we could compare them in our minds to the kind of perfectly clean and wonderfully clutter-free homes of robotics advertisements and even research spaces that are designed for studying how robots might work in home environments. The home environments of our participants were very different. There was a lot of stuff on the floor. There was also a lot of technology, though not maybe as advanced as robots. Another thing that I wanted to point out is how much people really defined the robot as being something that they experience within the family. So one of the things that we did was create, kind of ask people to design, to show us their kind of home space, where they would put the robot, where they wouldn't use the robot, but also come up with different kinds of use scenarios. And this is a robot dog. Again, the dog comes up all the time as a kind of specter in relation to the robots. And here, we see lots of different things, like we want it to connect with me, lick me, play with me, but also keep an eye on my grandchildren and be able to interact with them. So when people are thinking of robots that they can use in everyday life, it's not just about how they might interact, but how other people in their environment might interact with the robots. We've also given robots to people to keep in the home, paros, and one of the surprising things they chose to do with them was to actually show them to other people and inspire more interaction between themselves and other people through those robots. So I know we started a little late, so I'm going to skip some slides so we can finish and actually have an interaction or some questions. So the last thing I wanted to tell you about is some things we've seen in ongoing work with nursing homes and other spaces, and more institutional spaces, where people come into connection with robots, which I think are also a part of domestication. And in a sense, they're easier to see now because there's more work. It's easier to kind of leave a robot in a nursing home than to leave a robot in a person's home and then actually follow what happens. But one of the things that we've seen in terms of leaving robots in nursing homes and just, seeing what happens over a period of months or even a year or two is kind of a process of ongoing adaptation. And its adaptation, Paro is not a very adaptive robot in the sense of it does what it does and you can't really change it. But what we see is actually adaptation of what the robot means and how it's used by the people who are in the nursing home. So one thing we've seen is different individuals interpreting the robot differently. So some people will talk about the robot as a pet and use it as a pet. Some people will actually talk to the robot as kind of almost a therapist. So they will reflect on their own state of being and say like things about, are you lonely? I'm lonely. Are you lonely? Did they just dump you here and leave you? And it's really talking about one's own situation. And again, as I mentioned before, they often use robots as social mediators. So we've seen people who never interact with the robot by themselves, but they actually go to the robot when there's somebody else around and they start petting it and then they start talking to another person through the robot. It's kind of like you could use a dog on a walk. People will, I think, come up to people with dogs and say like, can I pet the dog? And then you actually start having a conversation around that particular creature that might not have happened if it wasn't there. We've also seen nursing staff kind of develop different ways to use the robot in one-on-one sessions, calming agitated residents. And these are different in different environments. So we've done studies in many different nursing homes. And some of the things we've seen is that in more kind of busy nursing homes where people are very much more functionally oriented getting tasks done, the robot is used as a tool. In more maybe laid back nursing homes where there's more of a more resources, more of a division of labor that's easier to kind of follow. The robot is used more as a pet, more as a companion. So really, the organizational situation also really affects what happens with the robot, how people make sense of it. And I think one thing that's important here is to actually make the human labor visible. So when we think of robots and their effect, it's often attributed to the robot. But what we've seen is that if you put Paro in a nursing home, it just doesn't work by itself. You need constant ongoing effort by staff, by older adults, by family members, by researchers, by other people to actually have the kinds of interactions that we're used to seeing on, videos or even in papers. So bringing back human labor, I think, and the visibility of human labor and actually incorporating that into design is very important. And finally, I think we can also think of robots as not just serving individual goals, which is how we often think of, does it make this person feel psychologically or physically better? Do they like using it? Those kinds of things, but it can actually serve community goals. And I think that brings us to different ideas about design. So we've recently, with one of my students, Swapna Joshi, been working on this notion of community robots and talking to people in nursing homes and also in an intergenerational daycare about how they might use robots to help serve their goals. One of the things that's emerged from that is the notion of a robot as a social enabler, so a catalyst for interaction with other people. And we've actually tried different kinds of robots, a Now, a Paro, a robot dog and cat, in the intergenerational daycare to see what inspires most of the interpersonal interaction, not interaction with the robot, but interaction between people. And they're different robots from the robots that we're used to designing. So often when folks design robots, we think of, well, how can we increase engagement with the robot? How can we make sure people are responding to it and focusing on it and talking to it, whatever they're supposed to be doing? Here we actually saw that the robots that got people interacting with each other the most were the ones that had a bit of a slower interaction, like Paro, that maybe you could pet while you were talking to someone else. Or actually robot failures. So now we had a Now there, and sometimes it wouldn't be able to hear what people were saying or answer their questions correctly. And that actually got people talking to each other much more. So I want to throw this out there that the design for these kinds of community supportive robots can have a different logic than what we're maybe used to. So I just want to kind of wrap up with what maybe we can learn if we're going from this notion of autonomous robots and companion species. So one thing that I think we can start thinking about is realizing and reflecting on this coevolution, which is an ongoing process of people and their machines, of ourselves and robots. I think we also need to think through how we design different social norms, values, and even societal structures as we design these new robotic technologies. I think we can acknowledge robots as actors in our communities, but we also need to remember the labor of all the various behind the scenes, in front of the scenes, and on the side of the scenes kind of human actors that go into creating productive experiences with robotic technologies. I'm very curious in thinking about how we get more diverse notions of sociality and culture into robotics, and also thinking about how we can maybe develop robots in a way that isn't about automating and monetizing our social relationships, but actually empowering people to improve themselves and their environments. And I think that this notion of companion species is rich enough. I just started kind of looking into it, but I think it's rich enough to maybe bring out some of these, some of the more critical thinking that can help us with these questions.